Death can sometimes be considered a taboo topic in some places, but for the Mizo people, death has always been considered an integral part of life, treated with reverence and customs that the whole community could take part in as they ushered their dearly departed into the afterworld. In the old Mizo society, there was a myriad of customs connected to funerals and burial rituals, with all of the various Mizo subtribes having their own variations of those customs. Welcome back to Hello Mizoram. We're going to be continuing on with the Cultural Heritage series, and in this video, we'll be looking at how our Mizo ancestors handled the concept of death with many mysterious and wonderful traditions. However, those customs and the way that Mizos approach the concept of death have changed drastically over the last century or so because of the emergence of Christianity and its rapid acceptance in society. In his book on Mizoram, Indian journalist H.G. Joshi talks about the transformational power that animistic religion had on pre-colonial Mizo society back then. The old religion has a way of life with the Mizos. The religion had cast its shadow on all aspects of Mizo life in the past. While it has now become customary to term the old believers as heathens associated with savage practices, the study of Mizo religion shows that it was quite developed and did believe in the existence of God. Together with this, the Mizos also believed in the existence of supernatural powers which guided the human destiny. The Mizos had coined their own explanations for the supernatural happenings like the world's other faiths and dogmas. While there was no direct form of worshipping the Patian god, they attended to the various spirits or supernatural powers that they felt and saw around them. Traditionally, the Mizos believed that the big trees, rivers, and mountains had spirits which were to be appeased with sacrifices to avoid misfortune. These spirits were believed to bring illness and calamities. The Mizos believed in the existence of soul and life after death. Hina, which means death in the Mizo dialect, was taken so seriously by our Mizo ancestors even hundreds of years ago that there were many different ways of referring to it in the language. For example, Zankatmitsin is an euphemism which means going to sleep at night, closing one's eyes, never to awaken again. There's also Nukzat or Zatla, which refers to an imaginary life cord that snaps in the blink of an eye. And there's also Zatluanram Minpansanta, which means they have gone on to eternity before us. And all of these euphemisms are still used in the Mizo dialogue today. As we've touched on in our past videos regarding the different social strata of Mizo social hierarchy, from the village chief to the village widows to the common man, we also see that there were different types of death, categorized by the way in which someone had died. The prominent Mizo historian Ge Zola wrote about how our early Mizo ancestors believed that death was often caused by supernatural beings or events beyond the earthly realm. One example is a character called Manghava, who was perceived by Mizo ancestors to be a supernatural being, a harbinger of death who carried a bamboo basket filled with human heads, and he would wander around the village streets looking for more heads to add to his collection. For early Mizo society, how a person died was an extremely important thing to categorize because it was going to dictate how that person was mourned and buried. The Mizos believed that there were good ways to die and bad, cursed ways to die too. Number 1. Omlaiti. This usually meant a natural death, in that the death was expected due to an ongoing illness that could be explained. So someone who was omlaiti would have died due to frail health, an underlying health condition, or old age. For Mizo culture at that time, an individual who had passed away in this way, surrounded by loved ones, was actually envied because it was considered a more desirable way to go compared to others. Number 2, Lamzui. This was the death of an infant, either a baby who had died prematurely, shortly after birth, or any baby that had lived up to 3 months. Usually, there wouldn't be any specific ritual or feast that would be associated with the death of an infant, and a wake wouldn't usually be held either. Instead, neighbors would help the family place the baby in clay pots and bury them as quickly as possible. According to Malsawmdawngliana and R. Lalsangpuii's book on Mizo cultural heritage, when a baby died, lamzui, they would be wrapped up in cloth, and a piece of cotton wool dampened with the mother's milk would be placed in its mouth so it wouldn't get thirsty along the way in the afterlife. And then a chicken's egg would be placed in the baby's palm so that on the journey to the afterlife, the baby's spirit would let the egg roll down the path and the egg would eventually lead the baby to the land of the dead. Number 3, Raite. This was the death that was attributed to women who died during or shortly after childbirth, and it was the most feared type of death for women in early Mizo society. One custom that used to happen was once a woman had given birth, she would be made to fetch water from a nearby spring and carry the water back in bamboo tubes. This was so that in the event that the woman died after this activity, her death would no longer have to be classified as raite. Instead, she could now be classified to have died a natural or predictable death, that is, omlaiti. So dreaded was this form of death that when it did happen, nobody was allowed to gather firewood, weave cloth, or spin cotton at night. This was because they believed that the spirit of a woman who had died a raite death would roam the village at night trying to enter their homes. So everyone would hang a broken fern outside their door, which was supposed to ward off the spirit from entering. And in fact, everything that used to belong to the woman would be left untouched, from her spinning loom to her clothing. Number 4, Sarthi. This was often considered a bad omen of a death. Sarthi referred to any death that was considered unnatural or often due to tragic circumstances. For example, being crushed by a falling tree, drowning in a river, being caught in a fire, or being mauled to death by a bear or a tiger. Our Mizo ancestors considered this the most unfortunate way to die, and so they had certain customs that would address the mourning process accordingly. A grave would be hastily dug, and the body could only be carried into the house from the back entrance, not the front, and once a small ceremony had been conducted, the body would be taken out of the house from the back entrance once again. There would usually be no vigil because someone who died in this way was not supposed to stay in the house overnight. They would be buried as quickly as possible because the Mizos back then believed that not following these certain customs accordingly would invite another unnatural death in the community. Number 5, Zatamlak. This was a specific term used to describe a sudden death in the community that had no obvious explanation, meaning the death couldn't be attributed to a known sickness or obvious accident. First of all, za means 100, tam means shortage, and lak comes from the verb to take. Now, our Mizo ancestors once had the belief that every year 100 people had to be born, and so to make room for them, 100 people had to die. So if someone had died suddenly with no obvious explanation, it was believed that they had died as a tamlak death. That is, they were taken up to round up the 100th deaths for the year. Number 6, lengklon. This was a term attributed to a person who had died before getting married. Now, marriage was clearly an important institution in even early Mizo society back then, so the relatives of the deceased person would try to make amends for that by burying particular objects alongside them, to represent the presence of a spouse for the afterlife journey. For an unmarried woman, they would place the handle of a hoe to symbolize her husband, and for an unmarried man, they would place with him the handle of an axe to signify his wife. Number 7. Pungzol. This was the term given to someone who had died from an epileptic seizure. Back then, epilepsy was considered to be contagious, so when someone died because of it, as the body was lowered into the ground for burial, someone would cry out, "I was not ready," or "I'm not ready," and everyone would quickly take a step back to give a moment for the contagious nature of the condition to pass them by. And then they would take a step back towards the grave to continue the burial process. Number 8. Lenglaiti. This referred to the death of a young person, male or female, because in the Mizo community, even today, someone dying in the bloom of their youth was considered to be a very great loss of life and potential. So, to mirror that level of grief, they would dig their grave much deeper than usual, and sometimes they would cover the grave with stones to further signify their mourning. Number 9. Mi Inati. This was the event in which someone died in another person's house, and it was often considered to be followed up by the curse of subsequent deaths in the village if certain customs were not taken up immediately, such as the sacrifice of an ox or some other animal. And if the body had to be returned to a different village and they would have to travel through intermediate villages, they would have to let the body rest in the village blacksmith's workshop so it didn't have to stay overnight at anybody else's home. In past centuries, there was a series of rituals that would take place before our early Mizo ancestors buried their dead. For example, they would first bathe the body before dressing them up in fresh clothing. The body would then be placed in a bamboo structure that would allow them to be set up against the wall of the house in a sitting position with their legs stretched out before them. The man's weapons or tools, if he had any, would be propped up next to him. Friends and family could come to pay their respects to the departed by presenting gifts of food or money. This ritual was called Ral. The British administrator of the region at the time, T.H. Lewin, wrote about his observations in 1869. On the death of a father of a family, notice is sent to all his friends and relatives. The corpse is then dressed in its finest clothes and seated in the center of the house in a sitting posture. At the right hand is laid the dead man's gun and weapons. On the left sits the wife weeping. All the friends assemble, and there is a big feast. Food is placed before the dead man, who sits upright and silent among them, and they address him, saying, "You are going on a long journey. Eat." They also fill his pipe with tobacco and place it between his lips. These ceremonies occupy 24 hours, and on the second day after death, they bury the corpse. T.H. Lewin also wrote about the different variations that different subclans had of this custom. For example, he writes, "The Long clan hang the body up to the house beams for 7 days, during which time the dead man's wife has to sit underneath spinning. She may not stir, and if friends do not bring her food, she must perforce starve." During this whole time, when the body of the deceased person still held court in his home before his burial, everyone could bring traditional rice beer called zu and meat such as a pig or a goat that could be prepared as part of the ongoing feast in the deceased person's honor. They believed that the souls of the animals killed for the feast would accompany the deceased person's spirit as they journeyed to the land of the dead. Young men of the village would start to dig the gravesite, while the older men would start preparing the wooden coffin. Even though there were some variations between how the different Mizo subclans conducted their funeral programs, usually what would happen is that 1 or 2 days after the death, the body would be buried nearby the residence. The Mizo people didn't traditionally have a designated burial ground or cemetery, so people buried their dead where it seemed most convenient or nearby. Mizo historian Remkunga writes that the actual concept of a cemetery was only introduced to Mizo society in May 1930, and ever since then, every village in Mizoram has had a designated burial ground for its residents. The wife would wrap her husband's body with a traditional cloth called the pondum or zolpuan, which customarily she would have brought with her when she joined her husband's household on their wedding day. Music played an integral part in all aspects of early Mizo society, and this was the same during funeral rituals. A large gong called darkwang and a set of different-sized smaller gongs, collectively called darbu, would be played as part of the funeral ceremony. If the person who had died was the village chief, a tangtuapa or a basalcha warrior, all male individuals who had achieved certain status in the community, then there would be even more distinctive ceremonial features, such as young and old men alike bringing their guns to the veranda of the house and firing their guns towards the sky at regular intervals as a sign of reverence and mourning. Another distinctive and unique aspect of how early Mizo society conducted their funerals was that sometimes dancing would be incorporated. Young people of the village would perform the Zonglaizon. This dance was originated particularly by the Boy or Lai tribe, and it was performed on 2 very different occasions. The Zonglaizon could be performed as a way to celebrate a particularly successful hunting trip, when hunters would bring large or bountiful winds back from the woods. But the other occasion in which this dance was performed was at the funerals of affluent or well-renowned men of the village. Historically, according to some sources, the dance would begin with a husband performing the steps to indicate his grief as he mourned his wife. He would have to perform the dance vigorously until he was brought to exhaustion, at which point friends or relatives could join in and take his place, dancing on his behalf as a symbolic way to show that they indeed shared in his mourning. So this vigorous, intense dance illustrates the way our Mizo ancestors understood there was a soothing and reassuring power in collective mourning, that the family of the deceased could rest assured knowing that their village would rally behind them and help them in this difficult time. Once this dance was completed, the body would then be placed on a bamboo structure and hoisted up and steadily taken towards its final resting place, the grave. Mourners would cry and wail loudly as they followed the procession towards the gravesite, and once the body had been laid to rest, it was common practice for some of the mourners to return to the house of the mourning family and continue to grieve alongside them, keeping them company. This practice is still followed by Mizo people today. We're going to stop there because there is still so much more to unpack in the next video when it comes to the different types of burials and graves, and not to mention the perilous and mysterious journey to the afterworld that our early Mizo ancestors believed their loved ones went on after they died. See you next time on Hello Mizoram.